Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you may be, and whether you're watching live or archived. And welcome to episode number 60, looking at the screen, 2 of the Nautel TTT Transmission Talk Tuesday webinar series. I'm Jeff Welton, and we're going to talk about VPNs today. February's been IT month for us, so we're going to have some fun. Jerry mentions in the background he's just starting to order process for broadband to a new transmitter site, so we should have some fun. As always, I try to find people smarter than me, not usually a very daunting task at all. And this week we've got return guests for the third time in a row. Kevin Trueblood, Associate General Manager for WGCU Public Media in the Gulf Coast of Florida. Kevin, welcome back.
Hey, thanks. I feel like you need to start doing like a starting lineup thing. Be like, and now your starting lineup for Transmission Talk Tuesday.
And in shortstop, I shouldn't have made that shortstop joke just exactly when I did, but coming up next, we got Aaron Reed, the IT and Engineering Director for Rhode Island Public Radio.
Aaron, what an intro.
I think that's more of a bench warmer position for me, but yeah, thank you. It's appreciated.
There you go. And then we've got the designated hitter, of course, Alex Hartman, broadcast integration specialist with Wisconsin Public Radio, mad scientist, IT guy, and just general troublemaker. I miss any of that?
No, as mischief makers, mad scientist. Yeah, you covered bases. Ha!
There you go. So, of course, these are the 3 reprobates that we've had on all month long. I think hopefully at least 2 or 3 of them will be with us next week when we talk practical applications and cleaning up stuff. But before we get rolling, let's hit the housekeeping stuff, mandatory housekeeping stuff. I see a lot of familiar names, a few new ones again, as always, and that's always awesome. Welcome. If you are new to one of these and you're not aware, there's a little question box in your control window. Type your question, comments, criticism, concerns, sarcasm, snark, or any of the above. If it's politically correct or not too offensive, I might even make it part of the conversation. Hit the little send button and it'll pop up on my screen. I think it's going to pop up on Alex's this week because the people that were here last week will know that my audio or GoToWebinar had a little bit of a hemorrhage, and so it was what's Jeff look like mute. So I'm sure that my wife upstairs. I was going to say, I'm sure that my wife and several other people would say it was an improvement. If you're not shy and you've got a microphone that works better than mine did last week, hit the little hand raise the icon and one of us will unmute you and make you part of the conversation. So by all means, we try to make this as interactive as we possibly can. Also, if you're an SBE member with certification status, definitely an Nautel webinar does qualify for half of a recert credit under category I of the SBE recertification schedule. So grab your iPad, your notepad, your spreadsheet, your whatever you keep your attendance down on for keeping track of your certification status, jot it down there and get her done. If you're not SBE certified, why not? There's a whole bunch of them out there, including some pretty decent network engineering sort of certifications. Kevin, you're my primary pick-on guy for SBE being on the board and all. You got any networking certifications yet?
I've had the CBNT since 2008, I think. So yeah, I've had mine for a while.
Cool. Alex Kirk's asking what camera you're using because your video is particularly good. Now, I've seen the Dungeon of Dork and Despair, so I'm not sure. You must be talking about video quality, not quantity, but what cam you got?
It's actually the one built into a brand new MacBook Pro M1.
Oh, there you go. See, Kirk, another Apple. Alex is a
not
reluctant
by choice.
Apple,
not by choice.
A reluctant Apple convert, I admit. But you got to admit,
WPR is an Apple shop, so this is the company issued laptop.
And it's got some decent video quality, so good to know.
It does.
All right, moving forward. So we had a bunch of advanced questions and I threw them up here. Now a lot of them will be hit as we go further on down, but is there anything on there that anybody wants to just pick on and address before we get rolling?
Number 4.
Dante, okay, what do we got there?
No.
Keep it separate.
No, The tunnel adds latency in a VPN, so there's no way for the clocking mechanism to actually function over that type of a system. It'd be like trying to route Dante or Livewire over public internet. It just won't work.
It's not just a VPN thing either. I mean, Dante claims that you can run their traffic over the same network that you run everything else over. It's a blatant lie.
Yeah,
I mean, in theory,
broadcast
you
norms.
can do it, but it causes so many problems.
Yeah,
It's
they should
just
be discrete networks
yeah.
always,
I mean,
or at
can
least
you?
separate VLANs.
I was gonna say, can you even VLAN it? Does it still work? I've always just done them separately.
It's an interesting portion of how they do their clocking broadcast because they use PTP v1 instead of v2. So it's broadcast, not really multicast, in sense that if you have layer 3 networking switches that understand how to truly do a VLAN, yes, you can do a VLAN, but if you're doing layer 2, it still ends up everywhere.
Yeah,
So
then it's not worth it. Because the
right,
beauty
so
of Dante, it works on cheap hardware. I mean, you can get a TP-Link
sure,
Gigi switch, slap it in there for $100 or less now, and
right.
and there you go, and it works. So you might as well
And
just
it
keep it
does,
separate.
but yeah, it will never traverse the public internet, no different than Livewire or WheatNet. It will, and it does wreak havoc on networks very, very hard. So best practice is always keep your AOIP system separate, and for other reasons.
Well, I
It's
mean, for the obvious security reasons over and above everything else.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So
that would
that
be
was
the
a good
first
one
one.
to, let's see. And we are going to address the Cisco versus Walmart question later on. Same for open source. What about Cradlepoint? I know we've got some discussion on remote sites. Anything that just comes to mind at the top of your head on that?
Cradlepoints typically have like an IPsec option in pretty much every device they've ever made, because they know that they're used for business use. So that's kind of a checkbox they have to put on to begin with. I know the Max Connect stuff, because Josh uses Cradlepoint pretty exclusively, does have a VPN system built into it.
Yeah.
Yeah, the
And
biggest
Rafe,
issue you're going to have then is connectivity, because a lot of those, if you're on 4G, if you're on LTE, you may not have a static IP address, and that may be part of your problem. And whether or not whatever appliance you're using to establish the VPN can handle a dynamic IP address is another issue too. So there's some challenges, but it can be accomplished.
Right.
Yeah.
At least typically any VPN you deal with, you have to have at least one known IP address, whether it's static at the studio, static at the transmitter site, at least one side must have a known. You can do it name-based even if you have DNS service,
Right.
but using dynamic DNS. But yes, in general, it's always best for at least one side to have a static IP.
Yeah, and Shane Tobin's in the audience, and he's mentioning that the Cradlepoint, that they use them a lot for the translator sites, and it works well. And the caveat, since you brought up the Max Connect, is that if you are running LTE and you're not running prioritized LTE, you're subject to net traffic too.
Right. And remember, using something like Verizon or AT&T here in the US, they're double natted. Usually they have a carrier grade NAT behind them, so you can't call the Cradlepoint. The Cradlepoint has to call out.
Yeah. Dynamic DNS will not work in that situation.
Yep.
Yeah. All right, moving forward. So we're talking about VPNs in general. And so Alex, by the way, this morning, bless his evil little heart, sent me this picture, and I said, "Oh, that's cool. How'd you do that? Or what's the source?" And he goes, "Oh, I did that on Lucidchart." So I went to Lucidchart because he kindly sent me a link because he's an enabler like that, and he knows I like shiny new stuff. And spent much longer than I should have been. If nobody's familiar with Lucidchart, it is. So Alex, how did you describe it? Visio without paying for Visio.
Yep, exactly. It's an online version of Visio. It's free to make a couple of them to save them, or you can pay a subscription fee for it, which is a lot less than Visio, if you need a lot of mapping and saving and stuff like that. But Lucidchart is arguably one of the better things out there next to Visio. So if you have it'll even take stencils from Visio. So if you have like FortiGates, Fortinet stencils, Juniper stencils, you can put them all in there instead of using their generic ones.
Well, and that's one of those because we've been beating the drum over and over on network mapping, and this just seemed like a good tool for that, for flowcharts, for a whole bunch of things. Because I mean, you've got actual, physical facility photos or
Right.
diagrams here, so
Picture's worth 1,000 words, right? Pretty easy to
sometimes,
follow the flow chart, right? And I
yeah,
tried to make the graphs exactly that. So you got your internet on one side, the router and modem slash modem, like an ISP provided, like a cable modem or DSL
yeah,
line, doing your NAT and firewalling all in one little device. This is 90% of small America radio stations right here.
yeah.
You know, you got your studio facility on 10.0/24. Then you have an IP radio like a Ubiquity or Ruckus or some of the more exotic ones, cadmiums, going to your tower site, and they're all on the same physical subnet. So that's how a lot of them look.
Yeah. And I put the link up there for the main Lucidchart page. Aaron's got a link up for the for blog talking about Lucidchart versus Glitty. I can't even see it.
Gliffy.
Old Glyphy, old
It
people.
reminded me of Gliffy, and I thought people might be thinking of Gliffy. So if you're wondering what the difference is between Lucidchart and Gliffy, they actually have a FAQ on that.
Ah, cool. So Ed, I'm going to ask you if you could just grab that and copy it over into the general chat so everybody can see it, and we'll get rolling forward. So this is what you see a lot, and I like you made it bigger. Don't do this.
Yep.
So, Alex, I'm going to get you to lead the charge, and then I'm going to get Kevin to come back with thoughts.
Okay. So in a lot of guys out there who have multiple sites, and we all do, right? And 2 or 3 different remote sites, and they all internet delivered for telemetry or even STL, whether it be a barracks or a Comrex or a tie line. Just general non-line of sight, nowhere to get a microwave. This is how a lot of guys have done it. It's just you get internet provided everything everywhere, and you start poking holes and forwarding ports. Whether you're managing your transmitter or the Comrex audio or whatever, and you're doing the same thing back to the studio where you're putting a bunch of holes in for VNC or something like that to remote desktop into a server or a jump box, or dear God, right into the automation system. Don't do that. Dear God, don't do that.
And it used to be a zillion years ago when the internet was first invented and there weren't a whole lot of cowboys out there that you could get away with stuff like this because nobody was, I mean, you weren't dealing with 250,000 port scans a week.
Right, or an hour.
Yeah.
I mean, the other thing was too is, you look at this too, you'll notice that I set it up on purpose because I walked into this exact scenario. All 3 sites use the same inside IP subnet. Don't do
Yeah.
that. Give them physical locations, because when you do add that VPN component, you have to renumber everything because they have to be separate networks.
Yeah. So Kevin, thoughts on it?
Yeah, this is exactly, what I had in mind, because as Alex said, you walk into this in a lot of facilities that we're able to get internet, at transmitter sites. It's pretty ubiquitous, even if you're getting just some 2 meg, down, 768 up DSL connection, you have at least something. But it's, oftentimes we fall back to what we know. We get into the the ISP provided router, we poke a hole in the firewall and boom, there's our codec and we're done. But there's a lot more application to this, and if you set security aside, the biggest reason why you advocate for this is there's a lot more application you can have and a lot more convenience you can have to creating the VPN to give you greater access to your site, which is why you would want to do it, even if you put aside all the security concerns, because you are leaving yourself very vulnerable here.
Yep. And the advantage to a VPN is that I can make changes on the far end from the near end without actually having to physically, go and set up the access on the router side.
Exactly right. Or even for that matter, if you're just using a codec, you could log into the codec at the transmitter end and actually verify that what you're sending is there. Because a lot of times you're just blasting the data out and you have no idea if it's actually making it there or not, particularly if it's a site that's 2 hours away, you can't pick it up off the air. Well, now you can actually verify that everything is there and correct.
Yeah. stepping ahead a notch. So, you know, we've talked a lot about VPNs off and on over the past couple of weeks, and definitely hit it today. And so Kevin put up the what is a VPN, and this is probably one of the I guess entry level, but I mean, I use VPN a lot, but I use like a single user tunnel bear system on my personal laptop when I'm on the road, just to keep people from getting in while I'm messing around on, you know, the World Wide Web on an unprotected hotel Wi-Fi. So
Yeah, we're all used to this. I mean, like the little application on your computer, like 2 years into COVID-19, we've all gotten pretty familiar with this. And you know, that's not particularly what we're talking about here. We're looking more at the site-to-site things, which is, you know, as we say in the slide, it can be cloud-based, or it can be site-to-site, like you're connecting directly to your studio location or wherever your office is.
right. And I mean, the big thing, and we'll talk about it in a lot more detail. And, you know, and Aaron was talking about it earlier, whether you do it in-house or, and I mean, if it's something like slapping Tunnel Bear on a personal laptop for a personal, I mean, anybody can do that. Heck, I was able to do it. But if it comes to structuring a point-to-point VPN or a site-to-site VPN, at that point, you may want to enlist in some assistance. And like Aaron said, you had mentioned earlier talking about setting yours up, and you ended up calling into support, but you had your local MSP helping you out with it as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's exactly what happened. Well, I knew that I was going to need help because our MSP manages a Barracuda-based VPN. Like, I don't really mess with it too much, so I wasn't about to start on my first time out without them there to at least help me make sure I don't destroy it in the process. But as it turned out, even they didn't fully understand what was going on. And we knew it was going to be a little weird because we were using a Barracuda VPN at the studio, but we were just using the built-in VPN capability of a real basic TP-Link gateway at the offsite. And when you start mixing and matching models and manufacturers, you really have to go down to the basics, and you have to kind of know what you're doing, or at least, you know, have good Google foo, if you will, and searching out YouTube videos and things like that to educate yourself, because you're really getting into the fundamental principles of VPN. Whereas if I had a Barracuda at the studio and a Barracuda, what's a compatible Barracuda at the transmitter site, I think they call it TINA. I forget what TINA stands for, but TINA. And it's a VPN protocol that makes it a lot easier for the two units to actually connect to each other. Although then again, as it turns out, the MSP guy I had with me, who is no dummy by any stretch of the imagination, even he couldn't quite figure out what the heck was going on the Barracuda device, and we had to call into Barracuda's support and get one of their techs on the phone to show us the setup on their end.
And this is the point where I say that I totally. So Tim Barry's had his hand raised for a while, and of course, being terrible host at this, I just noticed it now. So Tim, I did unmute you. If you want to unmute yourself, then you know, feel free to say hey. In the meantime, Elaine was talking about my bottle of vodka, but it's really, honest, it's water. Primarily because I don't drink vodka. It'd be probably single malt or something like that, if anything. But on that note, so Shane was also talking about the point-to-point and let's see, site-to-site versus client-to-site. And Shane, I'm going to pull your mute plug as well.
And before you let him talk, because I know where he's going with this, it's a very distinct difference. So today, VPN has kind of become synonymous with Google is search, right? You know, VPN is private connection. There is a very distinct difference between remote access and site to site. They are very, very different things. Tunnel Bear, for instance, is not something you're going to sign your corporate system up to get into work services. That is for trying to find Canadian Netflix shows. You know. So Shane, what are your takes there?
Yeah, a great point, Alex. There are actually three different and very distinct purposes for VPN, and probably more, but the top three that I can think of, the one that most consumers are thinking of these days is for privacy and or accessing content in another area that they don't otherwise have access to. And those are like the apps that you can download to your phone from, like TunnelBear and all the other number of providers out there that say, hey, secure your internet traffic. That doesn't do anything to get you into your remote sites or anything like that. It's just for kind of your own casual browsing purposes. The other one is, of course, a client into one of your remote sites that will get you into that site. And at the very least, that's something that's fairly straightforward to set up. You expose one, you have the external IP address of the router. Maybe dynamic DNS, and you point, that's the only thing exposed, and it points directly to that. And then to get to anything inside of that, you have to go through that VPN client. And that works fine if you just, if you have a handful of sites and you just need, occasional access to them remotely. But consolidating them all, as your network gets a little bigger, that makes a lot more sense. And that's where the site-to-site VPNs come into play. And that's where it really starts getting a little bit more complex, because then you have to take things like routing into account. You have to take, whether or not the various devices at each site can actually talk to each other with that protocol into account. Hopefully, ideally in that case, you'd be using the same type of hardware at every site, same manufacturer at least.
Central management and authentication and stuff like
exactly.
that. So it's definitely a very high-level system management system. So if you got like a Windows administrator or, in Aaron's case, an MSP who does exactly that, they can roll out like LDAP and Active Directory authentications and stuff like that. So
yeah, but once you get past a handful of sites, it's definitely something worth looking into once you get to that point.
Well, even at a handful of sites, I advocate for central authorization personally. So if you need to get to your transmitter site, you always just go, you only have one front door. So you go in through the one at the studio to get to your other tunnels.
Yep.
That's the model I'm actively trying to move all our sites over to now, as we've kind of grown piecemeal, but that's Alex's way is the way to do it. It's much more secure, and also, to be blunt, it's easier too than trying to manage which one am I connected to now? And also, just like I have a whole bunch of Burke remote controls. I mean, they're great remote controls, don't get me wrong, but getting 4 of them to all interconnect with each other is a giant pain in the ass when you don't have VPNs set up.
Right. And I don't remember going through the pre-show here, Jeff, but I don't know if we actually touched on the differences between, because I think I sent you the definition, but split tunnels versus forced tunnels.
That's coming. So that's 2 or 3 more slides down the road. But before we get there, John was asking, and it's a good question, is there any way or any place to get good training on this topic that's concise and not full of a lot of baloney, is the quote, and it's not wrong, but concise and cost effective, because like we said earlier, I mean, a Cisco certification is a lengthy process.
Right, but there are, I mean,
I guess
what we're doing here today, VPN for Dummies, yes, we kind of tailor it more towards our industry. Instead of more IT centric, we're more broadcast centric, because we can relate devices, Davicom remotes, Burke remotes, Nautel transmitters, so on and so forth. Versus when you watch one of the videos on YouTube for training from like CBT Nuggets, they're going to talk about going to branch offices and accessing different ADs and NetBIOS and all this other stuff. Things that a lot of places, especially in broadcast, unless you're in one of the big corporates that have their own IT infrastructure, where it's really not your problem at that point, that's, those are the kinds of situations and scenarios. So they go right over your head when you go and look at these videos. That's why we thought this series was important to do, because for the past 10 years, people have been asking me, well, you make VPN sound so easy.
Well, I'll tell you, one of the ways that I do, we all, I learn by doing, and that's how I've learned a lot of things that I do.
I learned by breaking, so.
And break, hey, you know what? Failing and breaking is an excellent way to learn as well. But for me, what I ended up doing was, once I once I ended up, deciding the hardware that I wanted to go with, for instance, I've deployed a lot of Fortinet stuff. I just bought some old stuff on eBay and then watched a bunch of videos on how to configure all this stuff on YouTube and just, plugged them in my home office and figured it out. And, took the time that I'm like, let's make this work. Okay, now let me go put this in a remote site and let's see how this works. And just kind of learned by doing. You can buy a lot of this old hardware or even, relatively inexpensive hardware that you're talking about and just give it a try. I know the YouTube videos get sometimes, like you were saying, they can get a little convoluted or, a little too into the weeds, but I'll tell you,
granular.
Yeah.
well, you look at something like you go into Unify, like the Ubiquity stuff, and with Unify, they make that UI pretty easy once you get to know it. But if you've standardized, say, in the Unify hardware and the Ubiquity ecosphere, then it makes it easier for you to narrow that down and get more training on it. And that's why, Aaron, your point was excellent, that if you're mixing and matching hardware, it's doable, but it becomes a lot more difficult. You have to know the fundamentals because you have to make sure you've established the protocols and all the things and all the whatnot, and it'll
Let's
work.
use the good analogy here is try getting a Thailand to talk to a Comrex.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You have to go back down to lowest common denominator that both of them are willing to talk, and it's not going to be their highest quality option.
But if you're using something like the Ubiquity stuff with Unify, it's literally just, okay, what site did you want to connect to? Boom, boom, done. Like the hardware is the same on both, and they make it pretty straightforward to connect them. So, yeah, I would say if you know what hardware you're going with, there's tons of walkthroughs and even if it's cost effective for you to just buy it and just play with it and see what you can do.
And in the IT sphere, we call that a lab.
Exactly.
And I've got routers and switches sitting behind me that are exactly for that use. And I see John's question there that I will answer.
Yeah.
It's a label, John. IT VPN versus a broadcast VPN is just its intended purpose, right? It's still a VPN at its core. Thinking in a university environment where I have experience with that, Kevin has extensive experience with that. Playing nice with the university IT department, I know, is a daunting task. But make friends, because they're going to be way different. Their security policies are not going to be your security policies. For instance, like here at the university in St. Cloud, my automation system cannot join a domain. As such, I have no authentication. Well, how do I authenticate my VPN to get into that network and this, that, and the other? Well, I have to do my own. And working with campus IT to have my own gateway was a very lengthy process.
Remember the first time you plugged an importer in with Windows XP running on it, and the IT folks, whoa, what are you doing with that?
Yep. Yeah, they shut down the port. So there are things that you have to work around, and even in Aaron's case, he's probably got something very similar where he has to. It's called the cybersecurity guys love using it. Known risks or known or mitigated risks. So you have your assessment of what happens when I do this, i.e., open a VPN to the world. Where can they get into? What can they touch? And what is acceptable? What is unacceptable? And you basically have to talk to those IT people and see where the deal breakers are.
And that comes back to more and more university IT, and we're seeing it in our facility as well. And I've had the conversation with Greg, our IT guy, several times, because every time he goes to make a change toward zero trust, although I'm preaching it on the podium here, I'm kicking and screaming with the rest of us in the background going, hey, I need to be able to, I can't wait, whoa, I got to do another key click, what?
Right.
So, I mean, bless his heart, Greg's got the patience of a saint because, well, number one, he deals with me. But absolutely, that's where if you're dealing, like you've got a network and you've got to tie into somebody else's network, you really need to be on the same page and working together. And whether it's taking them out for dinner or whether it's just sitting down and having a Teams meeting to say, look, this is what we need to accomplish. How can we do that within your infrastructure?
Right. What tools
Swag
do you
Kevin's,
have to
Kevin's
help me?
smirking. I see Kevin's got a grin on. I think he's already got
No,
a story.
I just had this vision of like having to take them out to dinner and be like, so what do you feel about sharing networks?
Valentine's Day was yesterday, dude.
Right.
Actually, there's something I want to also touch on here for a moment. That also goes back to one of the questions that was, excuse me, submitted before the webinar. There have been, especially in the small and medium business, the SMB realm, there have been literally dozens, if not hundreds of routers that have been sold that say we can do a VPN, and they're lying. I mean, flat out frickin' lying. I speak from personal experience on this. I picked up a pair of they were rebranded Linksys, but they were called Cisco's at the time. The Cisco RV042s that specifically said they could do site-to-site VPNs. And I spent days trying to get those things to work with each other. And then, only then, I should have done this from the beginning, and this is what I'm saying to everyone now, I started Googling and I started looking up and I started looking around, and finally I found stories about how, oh yeah, the VPN doesn't actually work. They're planning on fixing it in a firmware release eventually.
Yeah.
Well, it turns out they never did. And so I ended up, I think one is still sitting on a shelf and the other one I repurposed for some sort of low grade other use that didn't really need anything particularly important. But yeah, before you go out, and I mean, the modern stuff, if something you would buy today, most of it usually can deliver on the claims, but you can't ever assume that. You know, you want to go out there and you want to Google thoroughly any make and model that you're thinking of buying to make sure it can actually do what you want it to do, versus, oh, well, maybe we'll do that in a future firmware release. Ubiquiti used to be notorious for this sort of thing, about claiming that they could do stuff, and it's like, no, actually it can't. And maybe someday down
from
the
the
road,
CLI, and you have to be a very advanced user to get to it.
yeah, like there was nothing in the GUI at all for that sort of thing.
So I want to preface the next statement here real quickly is, if you go to YouTube and just search how to size a VPN, because VPNs are encrypted. As such, it uses CPU horsepower. Sometimes hardware has accelerators in it to keep it going. So while you think, hey, I've got 60 salespeople and a handful of jocks that can work remote, I'm going to go to Best Buy and spend $70 on a VPN router and wonder why it doesn't work.
Right.
Because it can't support that kind of bandwidth or throughput in its encryption decryption engine. So make sure you size the hardware or software solution that you look at appropriately. 1 or 2 users, sure, the Best Buy thing's going to work. Much more than that, if you actually want to get work done, sorry, Greg, get a bigger one.
Yeah. Well, and that's like everything else. You know, you're not going to pull 10,000 pounds of fully loaded horse trailer with a Honda Civic. So, you know, I mean, now here's a good question or comment from Paul too. And this is a more for you IT sorts, but he mentions that also learns best by doing and seeing. And so folks will hit them with a rolled out system. And when you're making a change, and again, this is one of those areas where Greg's been just a godsend for me, because he explains why he's doing the stuff. And, you know, I may or may not agree with it necessarily, but at least I understand the why. And that's, I think, also critical. If you can involve the users in the process, it tends to make it a whole lot more painless for everybody.
The rationale factor. The rationale factor. We're us as engineers, when we're told to do something, a lot of us go like, well, that doesn't make sense. Why?
Yeah.
You have to come back with the here's why. And it makes sense to a lot of people. And
Ray mentions that we can pull the horse trailer with his Ram, and it's like, I've got a Silverado out there that I suspect would move it too. But yeah, absolutely. Again, number of cylinders, and that going back to the why aspect of it. Sometimes the why will not be the answer you like, you know, like I'll give you an example, because our zero trust policies and the way we've got the security nailed down. If I want to, I've got some not necessarily company oriented software on my laptop, just things that I've had approval to install. But now every now and again, one of these programs, and Putty would be an example, will send an update. So in order to get the update, I have to get one of the IT guys to remote into my machine to update it because I don't have admin rights, which is probably a good idea, because would you want me having admin rights to your property? I don't think so. So, I follow the logic. It is, sometimes a little frustrating because I want to do this right now. And for me right now might be 1 o'clock in the morning. And now I've got to wait till tomorrow morning, but I see the logic behind it. So that's what I'm getting at. Sometimes it's really necessary to communicate that why. Kevin, you work with a lot of folks. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, you got to have everything pretty locked down. I mean, there's no real way around it.
Yeah. But again, you got to tell them why you're doing it too. I mean,
Right.
and the cool thing about broadcast is it's easy just to send a link to KQED, and because they've made everything so public and so accessible to help educate the rest of us. And it's been a godsend like that, because you can
Right.
point people to it and say, this is why we need to do this.
Well, exactly right. And like I was saying last week, what I've typically tried to do in those situations where, they're really just insisting, hey, we need to do this, we need to do this, we need to do this, is to find the diplomatic approach and figure out what it is they're trying to accomplish, and then meet them in the middle. And thankfully, there's a lot of cloud-based solutions. There are ways to get around, and cloud-based solutions, yes, have their own security challenges, but usually it's finding some way to accomplish what they're trying to do, but still keep your network safe in the process.
Right. And that's kind of a segue. Let's see, did I actually move the slide? No, I did not. So we covered site-to-site VPNs somewhat. Is there anything else you want to hit on the concept of a site-to-site VPN? I'll start again with Kevin, just because you've already got your vocal cords well loosened up.
No, I think we've got it. I mean, the biggest thing, for what we're doing is talking about the site-to-site, as we had displayed before, is, we in the broadcast world are perfectly positioned for this because we manage so many remote sites. And even if we are not connecting studio locations, this is the opportunity for us to use these applications to get them to our already connected transmitter sites and what the advantages are to them.
Right. And I think, and this is just something that I may or may not still have trouble wrapping my head around at some time, but we talked a little bit before about like VNC virtual network connections versus VPNs. And correct me if I'm wrong, and that's highly possible. But basically, a VNC connection is I'm using my computer to access a computer on the network at the studio, whereas a VPN, my computer becomes part of the studio network.
Right, and you can use both. Like I do that all the time. I will bring up a VNC connection after I've logged into my VPN, but then I'm only accessing it over, the private network, so it's encrypted. I'm accessing a local resource, as opposed to just opening port 5900 into your firewall and going through your public IP space. That's where you run into trouble. And I have seen machines get hacked because of VNC being open. So don't do that.
Especially the guys who never set a password on their VNC logins.
Yeah.
Well, and even if you
Because
do,
that's easy, right?
VNC only supports 8 characters. That's not secure at all.
Right.
Like if you have to go down that road, make sure you get Ultra VNC. I think it's uvnc.com, and get the what do they call it? Is it secure DRM or secure VNC.dsm encryption plugin? For no other reason, that lets you use far more secure passwords. That will knock down about 90% of the hackers out there. Now, granted, that still leaves 10% of them. And believe me, there are hundreds of thousands of bots out there banging away on port 59 on every single IP address they can find 24/7, 365.
Brute force attacks are a very real thing.
Oh, yes.
Well,
I see it online. I used to have a lot more. I would poke holes on a non-standard port, and and they would still try and bang away on it, but I never once had them get through because I was using Ultra VNC, and they were trying all these 8-character passwords and they weren't getting in.
Right.
But still, don't do it. I got lucky is really what it boiled down to.
And to answer John's question there that came up there, the don't do architecture, that one, the do architecture, this is that. So what we've done here is we've added a commercial firewall router VPN appliance just for ease of use. Let's pick a brand that is pretty well known. Kevin uses them, I use them. I don't know if Aaron's ever used them, but like FortiGates. Very popular commercial brand out there. You can pick up the EOL models on eBay for a couple $100 to lab up. They still work. You just can't get the subscription services for them anymore. So like at the studio, we have to size appropriately, right? Where everything's going to connect to your remote users, your site to sites, all of your host services. So let's pick like a bigger one, like a 100E is their one rack unit box. Pretty nice little unit. And then on the other side, we don't need that much. You got your transmitter, you got a remote control, maybe a PC, an audio processor, maybe a couple other things. Very small, light usage things. So we'll put like a 40E over there, which is only a couple $100. So all of those devices, then because they're all the same brand, they do what's called a zero config. You just tell it its IP address, you give it an authentication, they do their own little swapping thing, and boom, it just starts working. It's basically, they've even got wizards for this stuff now, as long as they're within brand. It's called zero config. So as long as you can float it through, but if you notice the IP schema here, our studios are on 10.0.0.1, the AM is on 10.0.1.1, and the FM is on 10.0.2.1.
Mm-hmm.
The reason for this is because routers route. When you ask, these are all on the same subnet and you're trying to get to the FM tower, hey, I want to go to 10.0.0.30, which is my transmitter at the FM tower. The router looks at it and says, oh, that should be local, so I'm not going to forward it over the VPN tunnel or outbound because it's not the next hop, it's my network.
Right.
So you have to have them different so that the router says, hey, that VPN tunnel has 10.0.2.1. I know where to send that packet to get to 10.0.2.30 to get to the transmitter.
Yeah.
That's how routers work.
And John's asking if the scheme would apply when the cloud is the university network, and really it shouldn't matter a whole pile at all, again, assuming you're able to partition within their network.
You can do this on a kitchen table and a switch. The internet can be any dumb device that connects all these things together, as long as the logical portion of subnetting and the routes are all taken care of.
Yeah.
Because remember, the internet is at this point just Ethernet, and it's just translated on the back end that you can't tell. So you can use a network switch, like a little 8-port dumb Netgear, you can use as your internet and connect 3 VPN appliances, 3 different laptops, or your desktop PC or whatever, and make that happen in a lab environment.
Yeah, it's more about
and we're actually doing that here, where we've actually got an external facing Cisco appliance that is attached to a statewide network, and that's how we get audio around to different Florida public radio stations. So this is entirely doable. Basically, you just put whatever routing appliance and VPN appliance, you put that out in your DMZ with a static IP, a public IP address, and then you're done.
Yeah.
Right. And one of the things that is on here is the split tunnel. So what's the difference between split tunnel and dedicated tunnel is, and it's set up in the VPN structure itself. When you go through it, there's usually a checkbox or a configuration line that says allow split tunneling. And what that means is that for anything that needs general internet routes it doesn't know about, so you're trying to get to Amazon to buy a cable at the transmitter site, it will not go through the VPN tunnel out your corporate thing back at the studio facility. It's just going to use the regular internet and go. But if you need to get to, say you got a file for like the latest firmware upgrade from Nautel and you left it back on the file server at the studio, it will traverse the VPN to get that. So it diverges. It's a split tunnel.
Now the downside
is you are now still exposed to the internet that way, because your host then becomes that thing.
Yeah.
If the one back at the studio is big enough and sized appropriately, it should have intrusion prevention and intrusion detection built into it. So what you do is you force all traffic to go from your AM array or your FM tower back through those VPN tunnels to hit the commercial firewall at the studio that's doing all the heavy lifting, and out that way. So you only use the front door. You don't use the back doors. So those are the differences between them. There are reasons for split tunnel, like in remote access. situations are, I would say, typical these days. Depends on how stringent your IT guy is and how puckered he is. Simply put, because if you're, watching YouTube videos on lunch or whatever, they don't want to use the company bandwidth to support that because it's all encrypted, remember. So they'll split tunnel that kind of thing. But if you really want to not trust anybody and what they do, and if you're letting, dear God, never let anybody do this, use their own machines that you have no control over, connect into your VPN, you're going to force them through that intrusion prevention system at your home office and do all your detection there.
Right. And going back, though, one of the things I hear a lot, and I mean, I do similar lower level presentations because, of course, you guys are smarter than me. We've established that already. But I hit a lot of smaller areas, and then like we're a little town in the middle of nowhere. Why do we need this security? And it's like you're thinking physically. The internet doesn't care if you're like me in the middle of the woods 5 miles from the nearest town or in the middle of downtown Chicago. And you remember last week I showed 3 days worth of scan detection on the VPN on my mesh network. I ended last week with 438,075 scan attempts, and I am literally in the middle of the woods, in the middle of nowhere. So again, the internet doesn't care. And 742 active threat blocks. So and funny thing enough, coincidentally, only a few of those hit the Nautel registered equipment. So it's not even corporate, my corporate name. One question that Tim had asked earlier, Aaron had mentioned Ultra VNC, and Tim was asking Ultra VNC versus tight VNC.
I mean, to a certain extent, VNC is VNC. They're all just different flavors of it. The reason I single out Ultra VNC is because, and I always add this caveat because someday somebody will change this. As far as I know, Ultra VNC is the only flavor of VNC that natively supports encryption. I think it's still true, and that's why
that's because they modified it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And Ultra VNC can be a paid for subscription. If you want multiples, you can use it as like help desk kind of software like Bomjar or whatever. But yes,
they get the free version.
Their own stuff. Tight VNC is more closely related to the original AT&T Bell Labs version of VNC. It's just kind of there. It's very lightweight. It just works, but it is very much unsecure.
Yeah, I'm gradually moving towards everything being VPNs and tight VNC, just because tight VNC, as Alex notes, it's very small, it's clean, it's fast, it's very lightweight. There's not a lot of impact on your computer resources. It just works. But yes, it's hideously insecure, so that's what the VPN takes care of. Ultra VNC is more complicated. It's all still free, but it's definitely a little more effort to set it up. But at least you can use, I think, up to 64 character passwords if you want to, and that makes I mean, if you're gonna have to put VNC out there on anything public, use the Ultra VNC and put that encryption plugin in there. You will save yourself an enormous amount of headache.
Yeah. Good point. John had also asked, just looking at this diagram of Alex's, will the 1010.0x, 10.0 or 10.01x and 10.02x all appear as local destinations on the network? And the answer is yes. That's the purpose.
That's how routing tables work, is they all know where their next hop is, and that's one of those definitions you have to know is next hops.
But there is there's a caveat to that. This is where you get into why it makes sense to use the same make of router everywhere. It's because lots of times they can set this stuff up for you automatically, so that if you're at the FM tower, you can access the AM array without having to do any extra work. If you have to set up all this stuff yourself, you know, like for example, right now I have that VPN going between my studios and my offsite satellite dish facility. If I VPN here from my home office to the studio, I can't get to the offsite dish facility unless I do the next hop routing. And
Right.
because I'm using separate makes and models on either end, I have to manually all set that up. Now multiply that times 8 or 9 or 10 different facilities, and holy crap, is that getting complicated?
Plus,
It's
you also
doable.
have to do what's called an interconnect route. So you have to have a block of IP addresses, which I think was in one of my other slides there I sent you, Jeff, where there's a separate net block that you don't really use. It's designed specifically for each VPN tunnel. And so, you'll see your 10.0.1, your 10.2.0.2.1, and your 7.0.0.1, but you have like 10.254.254.1. That is what's called a /30, and that's the route that the routers know how to talk over to establish the connection and actually do things. So much the same way your modem from your internet provider gives you an IP address on both sides, you have to create another one above and beyond to traverse it. And that you do have to do manually. A lot of VPNs ask you, what is the VPN route? And again, this is a little bit more of an advanced thing. And like you said, if you do an automatic, like same brand thing, it figures it out for you. It's dynamically allocated, already looks at your net blocks and says, you're not using this, we're using this. Which can get you in trouble, had that happen, but you can usually manually change them. But yes, if you're trying to go from a Linksys RV whatever, or a Meraki to an Aruba to a Unify, again, you're back down to your lowest common denominator, and you get to do all the heavy lifting. So standardizing on a brand, and remember, your vendors will train you just the same, or offer some kind of training based on the brand that you've decided on. And it doesn't have to be super high-end Cisco firepower stuff that's multi-$1,000. It doesn't have to be Palo Alto's that comes with 7 figures. I mean, we did FortiGate deployments for less than $2,500 to 3 sites. It's not that bad. If you really want to roll your own and become your own support, you can do a software-based thing using an old PC. There are many, many different ways to do this.
Yeah, and we'll hit the pros and cons of that, hardware versus software, in a couple of slides. And I say a couple of slides, and I'll give everybody the heads up. We're pushing 5 to the top of the hour, not even halfway through the slide deck. And, when have we
we're
ever been on
ahead.
time? Yeah, I know, it's IT, right? So if we close it up at the bottom of the hour, we'll be doing good. If you have a top of the hour engagement and you got to go, we'll certainly have this archived. One question that came in from Jim, and he mentions that he realizes that it's not a replacement for VPN, but thoughts on computer sharing applications such as Screen Connect, TeamViewer, Splashtop, etc., etc. There's Splashtop, etc. So what are your thoughts on those? If you're behind a VPN, sure, go ahead.
I know what Alex is going to say.
Don't do it.
I no, actually, I use them. I use Pulseway personally and Splashtop to remotely administer other stations, and they work very, very well for that. They're out of band, they're cloud based. They meet in the middle. They all have a connection server, and then here, you're here, now go here to connect, and they'll make the connection point to point. Works great. Not gonna lie, they are very handy in a pinch. You can do it from your phone, your tablet, your laptop, your desktop. They just work. Over VNC, I would take those over VNC all day, every day. However, again, known risk versus mitigated risk. It is a cloud service. You have no control over that server. Realize what you're getting into and know your liabilities. Remember, now with more teleworkers.
Sorry, go ahead.
More teleworkers, your insurance company's starting to pay attention to the cybersecurity problems. So you start getting a ransomware. Well, your insurance companies come back at you and say, so what'd you do to protect yourself? Nothing? Okay, we're not paying. That's a thing.
No, I was just going to say the threat then moves from from holes in your firewall to making sure that your password stays secure and you're using 2-form authentication and things like that. That's basically what you're securing, and how you're securing it changes at that point.
Mm-hmm. And that's critical to know. One other thing, let's see, came in from Eric. IPsec tunnels between sites that have multiple ISPs. Does one define separate tunnels for each potential route, e.g., AISP1 to BISP1 or AISP2 to B, et
Yeah,
cetera,
yeah.
and so on.
Failover.
Yeah, that's a lot of routes to load balance.
It is, and that functionality is, I'll call it expensive. Not from a cost perspective, it can be, because those are really advanced functions of doing VPN failover, because VPNs are nailed up. They need to know both sides. So yes, but how are you going to keep the routes, in check? That's kind of some of the magic and the secret sauce for the vendors to do real failover like that. So technologically, it's expensive. Yes, you can do it. But what I do is I have 2 tunnels set up on my systems, and it's called a link failure. So if one side goes down, it'll turn up the other one over the other WAN.
And I mean, ultimately, equating it for those of us that grew up in a hardware world, it's like you can have a backup transmitter, but if the tower falls down, you're still off the air. You can have an aux site, and then you'll still be on the air, but it costs a lot more money.
Yeah.
And, at that point, you need to look at an aux studio because, well, that could go down too. So
Why buy one when you
know,
can have 2 at twice the price?
right. So the level of backup and redundancy that you implement in a VPN is going to be, it's going to tie directly to cost and time, the same as it would in any kind of hardware application.
Yeah, we ran into that with our TP-Link versus Barracuda, is that if we had Barracudas that supported TINA at both ends, well, this is at least what the Barracuda tech told us. He said it's not hard, not too hard when you've got that functionality to have it do failover on a different ISP. He said it's much more difficult, and we also found that the TP-Links themselves don't really support it, because if you try and create a second routing table based on a different WAN port, it says, no, you've already got a routing table for this first WAN port. I'm not going to let you save a second one, and leave it inactive for later use, because that's creating 2 routing tables out of the same routing table to different WAN ports. I'm not going to let you do that. But,
Right.
TP links are, they're cheap. They're not great. They get the job done in many ways, but they're cheap as hell. So you can't expect a whole lot of functionality out of them.
Well, right.
Right.
And
The
that
old get what you pay for factor.
Yeah,
Mhm.
and that kind of comes down to the question John's asked here: are the VPNs suitable and reliable enough for like SPL or program audio use, STL rather?
Absolutely.
And it
Even a
depends
TP-Link will do
again.
that.
Yeah, I say it depends too on the configuration. I mean, ours at one point was set up so that if my laptop went to sleep, it dropped the VPN connection. Now it's set up so it doesn't. For my aspects, it's gotten a whole lot better, more reliable for me if I don't have to type the password in every time I go pee or whatever.
Now, I would put a caveat in that too, because you can definitely move audio across it, or even video for that matter. But we're not talking about like multicast audio. You're not going to push live wire, as we were talking
Right.
about earlier, Dante across it. If you're talking a point-to-point AAC stream, no problem at all. That's exactly what it's perfect
Barracks
for.
links, Comrex links, tie lines, codec
Anything that can
audio.
handle delay is really what it
Yeah.
boils down to, or latency. I want to use the right term.
Or HD data even out of
Mhm.
your exporter. If you want your exporter to live at the studio and shove it over that way to the XGen, very easy. Is it reliable? Well, here's the thing about VPNs. When you go look at their spec sheets on the hardware platforms and even the software ones, which are harder to find, mind you, it depends. What is the throughput of that VPN based on what functions you turn on?
Right.
If you're just doing basic IPsec, a lot of them will run right at wire speed. If you want layer 3 intrusion prevention, cut it in half. If you want detection and self-healing, cut that in half.
Yeah.
So you
And
can
Kirk
have one that
makes a
says
really
8 gig throughput, but when you turn everything on, it'll only do like 20 meg.
Yeah, and Kirk makes a really good point too, that a VPN won't fix a bad network connection.
No.
That you're still limited by the quality of your ISP.
Right.
So, and that is, he's got a good point there, because he says some people think that a VPN will solve reliability problems. And no, if you got
It
a crap
actually will
connection,
exacerbate it.
yes, it's going to say a crap connection is always going to be a
Because
crap
remember, it's
connection.
encrypted. If you screw up the encryption portion of the bits, it's going to sit there and retry and retry and retry, making it worse.
Yeah. So Eric asks about STL-AC stream. Can an IPsec tunnel be defined without encryption for the traffic to avoid delay in processing traffic that's going to be public in a few seconds?
IPsec, what does that stand for?
IP security.
Encrypted. No, there's
Yeah.
no. PPTP is what you're thinking of, which rides on IPsec. So point-to-point tunneling protocol. This is as old as they come, slow as dirt. You know, there's two layers of a VPN. There's the first negotiation layer, which is what it's transporting, and then the encryption system. So the common ones is PPTP, and IKE v2 for the second handshake.
I think we need more acronyms.
Right. Well, IKE is Internet Key Exchange. So that's the keys that they use to authenticate against each other.
Yeah, and I think he was referring more to the I guess reducing latency for the stream, which, you know, you're still traversing the public internet, so no matter what you're doing, you're gonna have latency.
You have jitter. You're gonna have latency.
Delay.
It's out of your control. Period.
Right. So you're talking a very you know, yeah, maybe there's an extra latency, but you're talking an insignificant amount compared to what you're doing over the public internet.
As soon as you introduce the public internet, you stop monitoring off the air, period. As soon as you deal with IP audio, you are no longer monitoring over the air, ever.
Right.
So throw real time out the window right then and there.
And as soon as you add any amount of compression to it, then you've got buffering anyway. So, you know, at that point, yeah, it's going to be what it's going to be. Let's see, VPN won't be the bottleneck in latency. The connection will determine that for the most part. That's from Shane. And that's not true. But now Eric clarifies that just eliminating the processing and need to retransmit if an encrypted packet is lost. So more of a UDP style, fire it and forget it type system.
Again, it's the tunnel factor, and that tunnel is going to carry that traffic as fast as it can. Because remember, the encryption happens coincidingly, not at the same time. Yeah.
So I moved the slide forward, and I think the only thing you've done was change your other picture just to make it more applicable to a. Okay,
this is more defining the IP addresses with the tunnel IP addresses, like we discussed, and this is basic routing. This is how routers route. This is where they need to know how to get to the next thing in line. So you've got 3 different public IPs from 3 different service providers, and you set up your inside networks, and here's your tunnel IP addresses to go between those various networks. And all of them share. You can have the AM array also have a tunnel to the FM tower, and you can create a mesh. So you can nail up another line that goes through there to get from one side to the other, instead of going all the way back and coming through. So if you got a guy at the AM who's having a problem and you're at the FM, you'd have to traverse the entire tunnel and come all the way back through. You can nail up a line between the two as well. But you'll see those tunnel IP addresses that you have to have there. /30. When you hear someone say /24, /30, /25, /16, /8, those are net blocks. That's your net mask when you see that. So 255, 255, 255, 0 is a /24. It's a bit mask. A little bit of nerdy talk, but that's the fundamentals of how IP works. If you ever have to take, if you ever want to take a CCNA or a networking class, a basic networking class, they make you figure that out in binary. Not that you ever have to figure it out now in binary, everything's done for you, but for beating it into your head on how that's figured out, you get to count the bits.
It's all ones and zeros. How hard can it be?
Right. So a /30 is 4 IP addresses, 2 usable, right? So you got your network IP, host IP, broadcast IP. So the outer and inner are not usable, but the middle 2 are your hosts. So you got one that's the commercial router at your studio and the other one at the AM array. And those 2 IP addresses will talk.
And again, throw a little plug for the latest edition of Networking for Dummies. It's actually on order on my Amazon account right now. So, you know, because the title seemed very appropriate for me. Anyway, on that note, moving forward. So, of course, this is, I put the cart before the horse, but why are we talking about VPNs at all as opposed to everything else? And this is Kevin's slide, and I think I maybe put it a little further back in the slide deck than I should have. But is there anything on that we haven't really discussed a whole lot? I mean, I think the convenience is the big thing, right, Kevin?
Oh, for sure. I mean, that's what I was saying. Let's take for instance, you know, even if you're just sending, I've got one site that all I'm doing is just sending audio over IP over it. Well, I had an issue with one side of it where I lost connectivity, and I was able to log into the other end, to the box on the other end, and make sure it was connected and fix an issue on that end. And I was able to make everything connected without having to drive 45 minutes out to the transmitter site. So it saved the day.
Right.
So, I mean, there's a huge convenience factor for it. And I noticed that Department of Redundancy Department called it a local LAN, which is the same thing. But
Part of a local area.
That's an
network.
L-LAN.
it's a very local, hyper local.
It's like an ATM machine, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, that's exactly it. We've already covered a lot of this stuff, but yeah, being able to access your transmitter sites as though they're local is by far the biggest thing.
Right.
Right.
And
And John asked the question.
Yes.
I wanted to hit this question because it's kind of important. How would a dedicated IP STL fit into this architecture? We kind of covered that right at the beginning, is where if you have a dedicated link, you can just, that's considered part of your studio. If you wanted to, you could IP segment that. So 10.0.0. whatever is your studios, and 10.0.1 logically, because it's just an Ethernet bridge, would go out to your transmitter site and they would just know how to get there because they're on the same physical subnet. It's just an Ethernet bridge. So in that respect, you don't have to do a VPN. As a matter of fact, if you have the option, don't. If you're directly connected. That being said, I do encourage firewalls at remote facilities, because you just don't know who's over there. If it's just you in the middle of nowhere on a mountaintop in Vermont, cool, don't bother. But chances are you're not the only guy up there. A lot of us have shared tenants facilities and stuff like that where they're walking around with their laptops. You got an open Wi-Fi for your security cameras. Yeah,
over and above that, if you're traversing over like a point-to-point wireless bridge, I mean, now you got a radio wave and you don't control that from end to end.
Right, and like we covered in a couple episodes ago, was Wi-Fi is inherently insecure. The protocol they picked for the security was cracked before they invented the protocol. Yep. So remember that part. That's why things like Unify and Ubiquiti's radios, or carrier comms and all those guys, have their own little special modulation techniques and secret sauce that obfuscate those, so that your normal laptop can't associate to them.
Right. And then the security through obscurity. But one of the things that Joe had asked, so most self-discovery protocols can't be passed between sites, correct?
Self-discovery as in like NetBIOS traffic or SMB, those kinds of things. Again, there's sauce in there that can make that work, especially if you get similar branded stuff. But in general, yes, like NetBIOS and SMB names and stuff like that don't really work through VPNs all that well. So you got to remember IP addresses or use a DNS server to do that.
Well, and that's more of a function because they're on two different networks at that point.
They're on two different networks at that point. They don't see each other in the broadcast domain. Yes.
Yeah. Oh, like setting up a Comrex? I'm going to say, I'm assuming it's Comrex. Comfax is what I'm seeing on the screen, but Alex, you can see the same screen I can see.
Who said that?
And I know you've got more monitors. So yes. Anybody who hasn't seen Alex's Dungeon of Dork and Despair, we need to get a picture of it someday.
You kind of see one over here. This is one of my 34-inch ultra wides, and there's one there and one there, and then there's a 50-inch over there.
Because need more monitors. Meanwhile, I'm sitting here looking at a 20-inch and a laptop screen, and now I really feel what's the word I'm looking for?
I just don't go to the optometrist. I don't go to the optometrist. My monitors just get bigger. So for like setting up a Comrex and stuff like that, yes, actually, I have had that work, because for some odd reason, the way that they do their discovery, it's based on ARP. Instead of broadcast. So they'll send out an ARP request of who has this MAC address. Boom, they'll show up on a distant LAN. So you can have IP segments like a Comrex over here and a Comrex over there. It'll see both sides, even through a VPN, just because they use ARP. Because the ARP request will go through the tunnel and say, hey, do you have all this stuff over here? The guy over here wants to know. Yes, those do kind of work. Barracks I've had hit or miss with because of how they do theirs. It's all based on how their discovery protocol is written. I know Telos's works generally well. Tieline works really well. Comrex works well. I think Barracks is really the only one I've ever had problem with, but we all know my thoughts on Barracks. So
No, I got no comment there. So now one of shoot, I got to try this again in slow motion. Kevin's got the list of part due of applications in a broadcast environment, and so you've got send HD data in there, and I think we had some caveats on that earlier. And more and more I'm becoming, and I never was before, I'm becoming a fan of putting the HD equipment, the importer and the exporter at the transmitter site when I can, and running the audio over the VPN because I've got more control that way.
right. Now there's other things that like I've got a site here that I deal with, and it's a directly connected site, but kind of in the same vein of a VLAN. I extend VoIP over it. I'm doing audio over IP over it. I'm doing general control over it and management of my network over it. It's got a pinch point of a Wi-Fi link.
Mm-hmm.
So all of that traffic has to go over a dedicated Ubiquiti radio.
Right.
And the switches on either side handle the VLAN tagging to know which ports go where and what data goes where.
Yep.
So you can do things like that. VoIP is really easy, actually. One of the easiest things to shove through a VPN. HD data, similar thing, except you can't use the broadcast address, so you can't send it everywhere. You have to use a
Right.
unicast because it won't
SNMP is
leave
a
the network.
really good point too. So Kevin,
Yep.
I'm glad you brought SNMP up because yeah, you could have one remote control system, SNMP based, looking at multiple transmitters.
Yeah, I'll admit that. I mean, we're not going over public internet, as I mentioned last week. Our sites in particular have, we've got Metro Ethernet connections, so we're actually going directly out there as though it's a private link. But that's actually come in handy for us because we've had like remote control units at one of our sites that failed, and because everything in the site was pretty much everything was SNMP enabled. I just programmed the other remote to monitor everything over there, and I didn't lose a beat. I was still able to get emails and texts and phone calls, and didn't miss anything. So, it could be a budget saving thing that if you're looking to upgrade your remote control systems, you've still got, some old science systems or something that's not SNMP enabled. You could buy one for the studio and let it pull everything that's out in the field.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and also SNMP is hideously insecure. So, I mean, you really want to keep that behind some kind of protection at all times.
Right. The broadcast thought that SNMP was the greatest thing since sliced bread. I was trying to get rid of it in 1999. Network engineers have hated that protocol for years, and nobody in broadcast has discovered what SNMP v3 is yet, which does have authentication, not encryption, but authentication. But still, V2C inherently insecure and bad. So keep that
Better
off.
V1 though, so there you go.
That's true.
But by all means, yeah, if you're running that, you absolutely need to be running it through some kind of security, and a VPN is probably your better option. A quick plug there, Shane mentions that the E2X can be a little dicey over a wide area network, the exporter to XGen if you're talking HD radio. And the plug for our NRHD, the reliable HD transport, because we repackage that bursty stream into a little more steady state that works well even over a limited bandwidth. So there, plug for our design, guys. That's as close as you'll ever hear me get to a commercial on one of these sessions. So there, it's been done. So, okay, we want to build a VPN. Holy smokes, we're an hour and 15 minutes in, and we're just going to start talking about what do we need to do this. So hardware, software, you can do it either way.
Yep.
Yes.
Realistically, if you don't have an idea of who to do, like Aaron probably went into it completely blind, didn't understand what the capabilities of different vendors are, that's where your MSP comes in. Not only, they're the ones who are, yes, they're going to have a favorite, right? They're going to pick their Sonic Walls or Barracudas, the Ciscos, but that's what they're trained in. But you've hired these people because they are trained in that situation. So if that's what they are, that's what you get. Don't save a buck by saying, well, this one's $300 cheaper, I'm going to go with them. Your MSP is going to say, we don't know it, we're not going to touch it.
Yeah, I think
so
if
lean into them.
if you are hell bent to learn this stuff yourself and you're starting from scratch, basically you're starting from, I really don't know anything about this stuff, but I'm handy enough with that I can set up a gateway. I can do a little bit of networking stuff. You're basically where I am, more or less. You can probably pick up, like, I would say probably Ubiquity might be your best bet because it's a good balance of functionality and inexpensiveness. And the online community for how those things work is fairly good. You will have to spend some time beating your head against certain things until they make sense. I'm not going to lie. But it's a good compromise of things where, and you pick up a couple cheap units and set them up on on the bench in, wherever your bench is, and mess around with them a little bit until they work. And then maybe, all right, find a less mission critical place to deploy it and see, and grow from there. You can do what I did, which I ended up standardizing on TP-Link a while ago. It was a good decision at the time based on everything else we were doing. But if I could go back, I would have gone more the Ubiquity route. And I think probably in the long run, that's when I have the money to replace everything, that's what I'm going to do. But the nice thing about TP-Links is also they're kind of throwaway boxes. I mean, seriously, you can get the new multiple WAN gateways, and the firewalls do actually, I'm sorry, not the firewalls, the VPNs on them actually do work fairly well. They're about the size of an iPhone, and they're $60, maybe 70.
Now, Shane makes a good point in the comments, a couple of good points in a row. Shane mentions that scrolling down, so okay, we got into monitor wars there for a little bit in the comments. Apparently size does matter. In spite
I
of
do want to bring up that Shane does bring up a good point about Ubiquity. As much as everybody loves Ubiquity, they do change quite often. As such, they upgrade certain hardware and software components on the willy-nilly. So you will have like OpenVPN version 3 and your other one's running 2.15. Guess what's not going to work? They are very well known for breaking their own stuff.
And they rely on the user community for the support in a lot of cases.
Correct.
Mm-hmm.
So
and that's something to be
while
aware
they
of.
make a really good Wi-Fi and backhaul system, I'm not sold on their switching and routing yet.
Going to say you didn't even
I
put
did
them on
say it
your
was a
list.
compromise.
Right. The reason why this thing is sitting on the bench is for multiple reasons. Its VPN capability was not up to snuff, even for a simple point-to-point. They use PPTP or OpenVPN. Those are your two options, and they don't expose half of the options you need to actually set it up properly. It's just a basic function. So if you have two of these, great, they'll talk to each other. If you have this and a FortiGate, nope, throw it away.
Yeah.
So if you're going all there, it makes sense. But yeah, and that's what Shane says.
And the throughput thing was a big
entirely.
kicker. Yeah, the throughput thing for me was the kicker. When you turn the VPN on a Unify USG, the throughput goes through the floor. 2-3 megabit at the most.
Yeah. And Shane had mentioned earlier that you could use OpenSense or PFSense and roll your own with software if you were a little on the geek side. And I see you've mentioned in your list here the Linux PC as well. And I may or may not have taken a dive into loading Linux onto a laptop last week just to see if I could. And surprisingly enough, it actually worked at the end of the day, and the boy is happy and life is good.
Yep.
So anyway,
yeah, there's a lot of things you can do in a software-based VPN. The Ether VPN, I misspoke there. It's Soft Ether. Ether VPN is what the product is. Soft Ether is made by the University of Tokyo, Japan, or something like that. Really nice, great open source software to do software-based VPN servers and clients. So you can actually do site-to-site gateways with it. Really cool, free, great for experimentation. So if you want to learn how it works, try that first. Then you got your appliance companies. Everybody's like, as we saw in the preview of the advanced questions, Cisco. No one can afford Cisco. No one can. Okay, you can't afford Cisco. You can't afford to be in business then. Stop playing that game with me. I don't care. Fortinet is cheap. Aruba is cheap. Cisco is cheap compared to taking you off the air.
And that's, I think it all does. I mean, it's like car insurance. It's the judgment call. Well, car insurance is mandatory in most places, so that's maybe not a good comparison. But you do kind of have to look at what, I mean, if you run a totally closed network with no connection to the outside world, less a situation, well, not even
The
relevant
best
to what we're
network ever
talking
made
about.
was the one that never got plugged in.
Yeah,
Mm.
so yeah, it's going to be a judgment call. And as Shane says, Cisco is the gold standard. He does mention earlier, he mentioned, made a good point that the advantage of hardware solution over a software solution is that when you buy a hardware box, you bought the support for it too.
Right.
And, depending, and I mean, you may have set up a service level agreement over and above that. But if you are playing on a Linux PC, you are the support network, and
Yeah.
Right.
you don't always have the time. So
And it's actually a really good marketability point to learn the software ones just as well as the hardware ones.
yeah,
I personally, like Aaron, I have to, for my FortiGate stuff, I have to lean on an MSP guy. I honestly don't know the very deep levels of it to do certain things like multi-routes and WAN failover and stuff like that. I call a guy because while I do want to learn it, it's lead by example. I lean on him to show me how to do it, teach a man to fish factor.
We should also clarify again, when we're talking about Cisco, we're talking about the real Ciscos, the enterprise
Right.
Ciscos, not the small and medium business Ciscos that are frequently rebranded Linksys and are garbage. Garbage is a strong word. They were garbage for a few years there. They've gotten better in recent years, but they're
When
still,
Cisco bought Linksys, that's where.
yeah,
they're still not very good. We're talking about the Ciscos that are like $1,000 plus.
Yeah,
Those
I
are
mean, the Cisco Firepower NGFWs, which are, barrier to entry there is like $2,600 before the support contract
Yeah.
right.
per
But
side.
if you need a big truck to get the job done, you don't buy a Yugo. I mean, is really what it boils down to. It's
Right. And again,
they're both cars, they'll both work. No, it's not how it does. It's just, you got to
Right.
get the
And
right tools
again,
for the
like I
job.
said, there's multiple specs, and again, it's worth the phone call to an IT consultant if you are out of your element. Spend the couple $100 to bring the guy in and tell you what you need.
yeah,
Don't just kind of, oh, well, Alex said I needed this $3,000 Cisco. I need a VM. No, you don't. That might not be your need. Maybe you
right.
need a little PA440 from Palo Alto. They're $600. Maybe it's a
Yeah.
FortiGate installation at a couple $100. It depends on your size. It is not one size fits all. Large enterprise, I can tell you right now, we're getting rid of our FortiGate because we've outgrown them and we're going to Palo Alto. Palo Alto stuff is a 6-figure adventure.
Yeah. So, I mean, again, it's like everything else, you are going to size it based on budget, need, and requirements. So, and the value of what you're protecting. All right. We're going to get close to the wrap up because we are 25 minutes past the point. You sent me a quick dashboard picture.
Yep, so this is what OpenSense looks like, and it is an appliance ISO is what we call them. It's preformed, it's not Linux, it's running what's called FreeBSD. It's a different kind of Linux made by Berkeley Designs, BSD. Feels like Linux, looks like Linux. The difference is that BSD software is peer reviewed before it is submitted to the software branch. Linux, 10-year-old could have written your Ethernet driver, you don't care because it works. BSD is a lot more particular. As such, the hardware options are limited, but this is what I run at home that I threw away the Unify for. Because it has, if you see on the left side there, VPN, firewall, interfaces, intrusion detection, reporting, all of this stuff in a software box. Now, that being said, yes, I have a gigantic 4U PC that is running, as you can see, an older i7 3930K CPU. I gave it 4 cores, a little bit of RAM. This is what it's doing. But this is my home firewall. It has 7 Ethernet interfaces attached to it, including a 10 gig link. It's got multiple VPNs to everybody I talk to and I work with, because I put my own appliance on their side so I can manage their
Now
network
he's just
from here.
bragging.
Yeah. was gonna say.
I know how to
Your
do
dominance
this.
has been established, Alex.
I know how to do this. I've been playing the game long enough that I am comfortable with this. You may not be.
Nope.
It's
I
really
look at
nice
it.
to work with, but you can get into the weeds pretty hard in this
Yeah.
world.
Now, Shane does mention a good point. The good thing about software based is it does force you to learn the concepts so you can actually set it up.
Right.
Because if you don't know what you're talking about, then it's, yeah. Now,
Mhm.
having said that, we got the multiple six figures for the Palo Alto, but you can go down into the consumer level and
Yeah.
get stuff, that'll do the job. And
Yeah,
Aaron,
small
you'd
business, home
mentioned
business
TP-Link.
stuff.
What was that,
I
Jeff?
say you'd mentioned TP-Link before, and I mean that's a good example of a budget version.
Yeah. I mean, I don't deploy that at the office. That's where we have the good stuff. That's where our MSP put in, the Barracuda that in theory
Right.
can handle 1,000 users
Yeah.
on the VPN connection. Plus, we've got all that other good hardware there too. This is the stuff I put out at our transmitter sites where there's only one user and that's me.
Yeah.
We don't have a whole lot of data flowing to each one of these sites on any sort of regular basis. I could probably get away with a 5 megabits down and maybe 2 megabits up at every single one of my remote sites if I needed to. Yeah, I mean, for things like that, again, I mean, if I had to do it all over again, I wouldn't have gone down the TP-Link route, but I did, and it has made it easier to standardize on some things. So at least now, when I set something up at one site, it's easy to replicate it at all the other sites and keep track of it at all the other sites.
Right.
By the same definition, you could do that with any of them. You could do it with Ubiquity, you could do it with Fortinet. It doesn't matter. As long as you stay consistent, it makes your life a lot easier. I mean, this is getting more into just being, the IT guy. It's just
Right.
that, the more consistency you can have, the easier your life is. But yeah,
Right.
I mean, again, TP-Links, I mean, the cheapest ones they have now, they work fine. They're $60. They've got multi-WAN failover. The really nice thing about TP-Link, I will say this, about a year or two ago, they finally started having decent documentation on their website. Which for years their documentation was just almost non-existent. Like if you didn't know what you were doing, good luck, pal. You're on your own. Now, like more recent times when I've been messing around with TP-Link's VPNs, the guides that they have on there are pretty good for making it set up. Like I use my iPhone quite a bit to so that I can get in and connect to a tight VNC connection on a desktop that I keep at each one of these sites, just for easier access. It took a little head banging, but it wasn't too bad.
And the new thing is always the cloud management stuff. Like Unify has their cloud key stuff where the MSP can log into their central account and manage your equipment, or you can own that. I think TP-Link started doing that as well.
They
In this
just did.
cloud management stuff. It's very new. I have no experience with it, so I couldn't comment on how it works. But those are the double-edged swords. We're talking about security, but that is a very easy button to hit, right? You have a central management for all your site, but it's also hosted by them. They change their URL, you just have a pile of boat anchors. Or they can easily get hacked just the same. You don't know what their security is. So the cloud management stuff, tread lightly, trust it, but vet it, I guess is what I would say. It depends on what your pain tolerance is for risk.
Well,
Well,
and it's like
flip it the other
everything
side.
else.
If your URL's changed, that's probably a sign that your gear is out of date and needs to be replaced anyways.
Very
I mean,
much
that was
so.
the thing about the Ubiquity stuff. Yeah, sure, it changes all the time, but
Wait,
lots of times,
Gear is out of date and needs to be replaced. Have you worked at a radio station recently?
well, that's
That's
kind of where I'm going with this, is that you can't just buy the cheapest stuff and expect it to last forever. I mean, a lot of this cheap stuff, you got to plan on replacing it in just a couple of years because it won't support the newest
And that's
security.
why I bang my head against the Ciscos, the Fortinets, the Palo Altos. They support their stuff by the rule of law of Europe. If they sell one of those into Europe, they have to support it for a decade. Well, if you're getting a decade out of that equipment,
That's not
cool.
bad.
Yeah.
So, Yeah, and again, it comes back to you get what you pay for in a lot of cases. Okay, so we're at the bottom of the hour. This webinar, as with all Nautel webinars, will be archived. You'll find it on the website as soon as Ed gets it up, which is usually pretty darn quick. It is nothing if not responsive. Quick shout out to Mr. Disembodied Voice himself, Ed Sylvester, in the background making stuff happen. Thanks, Ed, for all you do.
Thanks, fellas.
This is going to say this is the part where Ed's scrambling to unmute himself. I do this just to put him on the spot and make sure he's still awake and not napping. You'll be able to find this on the YouTube channel. Before we shut the door real quick, Kevin Trueblood, any last minute thoughts?
No, this is great. And I've spent a lot of time, I've picked up a lot of contract work over the last couple of years. And, you know, what kind of inspired this particular one was realizing how many broadcasters from small to large are not doing this. And hopefully this provides some inspiration to, and provide some insight to why you should be doing it, why it's worth your while. And hopefully we've turned some people onto the idea.
Thanks very much for joining us and making part of that happen. Aaron Reed, what are your thoughts?
Listen to these guys. They know way more than I do.
You can always tell who's got their display pointed by whether they go this way or that way.
Yeah, exactly.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for being here. And Alex, you've got 30 seconds and then I'm going to hit the mute button. Go.
All right. So like Kevin had said, you know, we were hoping this inspired you to take a hard look at what the way your operation is running. Both ways around, right? Engineers, have this conversation with your management. Management, if you haven't asked this question of your engineers, maybe it's time. You really need to be on the same page with this stuff.
That was really good. It's like he had a stopwatch in the background. So again, Alex, thank you very much for your time today. On that note, folks, thank you guys, and people watching, thank you very, very much for being here. We hope to see you next week when we talk practical applications. Have a great week.